Okay, so welcome everyone to the 22nd talk in our International Philosophy Talk series, held by the Department of Philosophy at Marmara University here in Istanbul. We are honored to have with us today Professor Anthony Shaker. First, I would like to start by introducing Professor Shaker. Professor Shaker obtained his doctorate and master's from the Institute of Islamic Studies in McGill University. He is a scholar of philosophy and its history. He has authored several books in Ilm al-Hikma and contemporary philosophy. Most recently, he published two books. One has the title, Reintroducing Philosophy, Thinking as the Gathering of Civilization, published in 2021. The other has the title, Modernity, Civilization, and the Return to History, in 2017. He has also translated 4 books from Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulum with the title Islamic Text Society, published by Cambridge University Press. He has also published some papers. Let me mention the names of his 4 papers because they are directly related to today's talk topic. The name of one paper is Interpreting Molla Sadra on Man and the Origin of Thinking. The name of another is Nature Along Man's Journey of Return. Another one, The Paradigmatic Significance of Perception in Molla Sadra's Philosophy of Being. And the last one, Man, Existence, and the Life Balance in Islamic Philosophy. In addition to them, he published several articles on related topic as well. He is presently researching and writing a new monography tentatively entitled A Study of Philosophical Reasoning, Its Method and Ends since Konevi. So today's talk is entitled The Ends and Method of Philosophical Reasoning in the Hikma Tradition. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Shaker. Thank you again for participating in our philosophy talk series. The floor is yours, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very happy and honored to be here, especially with distinguished professors and scholars like yourself. Just one correction, if I may. My translations of Ghazali were done with the Islamic Text Society, not with the Cambridge University Press.
Sorry.
I may have made that mistake myself. Anyways, just one word before I start. I like to, when I talk about philosophy, I like to place it in a wider context that most scholars do. So I hope you'll be patient with me. I'm going to try to give you a wider context than is usually done. Now, this lecture has 2 main objectives. The first is to illustrate how contemporary philosophy has generally oriented itself and where I believe it has gone astray. There are other reasons besides those internal to it that suggest it has in fact reached a dead end. One has to do with its historical circumstances, and I'll get to it shortly. You'll perhaps agree with me that the frameworks in which what passes for philosophical debate these days have largely been Western or Western inspired. I've always viewed the situation as both an anomaly and a tragedy, considering the unparalleled longevity of philosophy in the Islamic tradition, not to mention the philosophical traditions that emerge in the rest of the world. The so-called West, by which I mean mainly England, France, and the United States, is a very recent arrival on a world stage. Sorry, I heard some noise. Is somebody trying to say something?
There was some echo, that's all.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Apologies.
That's okay. The so-called West, by which I mean mostly England, France, and the United States, is a very recent arrival on the world stage, and thus indisputably the product of much wider historical processes. There's no basis whatsoever for believing that the West has suddenly popped into existence, or that instead of exercising world domination for about 150 years, all told, it somehow managed to subjugate the whole humanity the instant Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean some 500 years ago, or for that matter, that its history stretches back to antiquity just because part of an ancient civilization had a foothold in eastern most corner of subcontinental continental Europe. This is basically the stuff of mythology. But what should be of particular interest to thoughtful people everywhere at this stage is the post-Western multipolar world we have entered that's quickly leaving behind the West politically, economically, and as far as we're concerned, philosophically. One way or another, we as teachers, scholars, and philosophers will have to come to grips with this new historical situation. In view of the untold tragedies of Westernization, the effects of which have been minutely documented and are clearly observable today, the new situation entails that we refrain from referring constantly and unthinkingly to Western intellectual gurus, their patterns of thinking, and their standards for what is true and what is real. There are other possible avenues for philosophers to take that have borne greater fruits and are more stable. And of course, new paths to explore. My second objective, therefore, is to give you a better sense of how philosophy is conducted in al-Hikma, the science or discipline of philosophy. And I'll use Sa'ad ad-Din al-Farghani and other important hukama for this purpose. Farghani was a Persian philosopher who died in 1300, around 25 years after the passing of Sadr ad-Din al-Kunawi, his teacher. At some point, Kunawi and a few of his students, including Farghani, set off to Egypt from the city of Kunya to study Ibn Farid's influential philosophical poem, At-Ta'iyya al-Kubra. It was this trip that inspired Farghani to write Muntaha al-Madarik, his Arabic commentary on that poem. He used this commentary to revise an earlier work in Farsi entitled Masharik al-Darari, which, however, lacks the explanatory Arabic introduction. This was very, very detailed and complex. One of the most complex introductions in the literature, philosophical literature. But let me begin by describing one contemporary approach to the question of knowledge. I selected it not only because of its mainstream influence, but also because it exhibits some superficial resemblances to Ilm al-Hikmah, as you'll see. Over the years, some important English-speaking analytic writers have been musing about the need for what they call completeness and definiteness in knowledge acquisition. The goal of completeness was taken up by the real founder of the analytic movement, Frege, who in turn was inspired by Leibniz. Now, the desire for completeness was generally driven by a nagging awareness that the prevailing models and standards of knowledge were inadequate. The trouble is that in this undertaking to define everything, the onus was placed on technical refinements adapted to a set of what I would describe as epistemological speculations. I and others qualify them as speculative because they bear the marks of a hypothetical metaphysics of knowledge. This undertaking has resulted in a predominantly epistemological view of completeness, regardless how much ontology is invoked by this or that analytic writer. The difficulty with this view is that not everything can be determined in the mind or deduced from the comfort of an armchair. This is a state of mind of someone fixated on epistemology or even ontology, when I consider which I consider two sides of the same coin. That said, knowledge in the understanding of the analytic current, much like that of other currents, is not just any kind of knowledge. Rather, it centers on knowledge acquisition In a sense, of course, all or most knowledge has to be acquired by some means. However, we live in a unique time which the media has euphemistically named the information age. What this has done is relegate philosophy to the menial task of rationalizing the rules of processing information or data, whether through computers or through the mind. The end result is that philosophers, especially those of the analytic persuasion, have become myopically focused on devising complicated logical devices for the sole purpose of showing us not what it means for knowledge to be complete, let alone wise, but that any given argument or utterance whatsoever can be declared complete as long as it's internally consistent, whatever the consequences or other considerations that may impinge on thinking. I'm simplifying the picture, of course, because there are countless other counter currents equipped with their own brand of esoteric terms and arguments. But one has to ask how judicious this hypothetical path has been for the philosophical enterprise, if I may call it that. In the case of the analytic current, I think you can see how obsessed one can be about devising ever sophisticated logical means to ends that conceivably may well be of questionable value. The speculative musings I'm talking about have been part of a back and forth between subjectivism and objectivism for more than a century and a half that may well be coming to a head. You may recall Heidegger he once called subjectivism and objectivism two sides of the same coin. He basically judged them to be a dead end. While I agree with him, it seems equally obvious to me that the Western discourse as a whole has shuttered itself more on the side of subjectivism. I also find it hard to ignore how much the intellectual subjectivism of this discourse is part of a wider phenomenon of cultural particularism. The particularism I'm talking about has the peculiarity of inflating itself into a universal, to which all of humanity must then either submit or be coerced into submission. In the atomized society associated with the West, people from childhood onward are steeped in a radical form of individualism. They experience it every day of their lives. Each piece of mass media information and advertising impels them to think and behave subjectively. Not only is this outlook taught in schools and propagated by news channels, but everything in public and private life is invested with a monetary value or measured by some moralizing preconception couched in the jargon of a truth value. What is the philosopher in the West, or for that matter, in any place influenced by this culture, to make of this pervasive subjectivism? How can he or she expect to interpret the world without at the same time being absorbed by it? Another good question to ask, I believe, is the following. Can philosophy regain its status as a sanctuary where rational human beings can discuss matters of importance to humanity, not just important to a particular interest group or a private individual or a philosophical circle? Is it possible anymore to speak in the voice of humanity instead of pretending to speak in its name? Before returning to the analytic current, let's briefly consider the idea of completeness from the perspective of Ilm al-Hikma. The completeness of knowledge there, if I may summarize it in a single phrase, is one of perfecting or istikmal. Ilm al-Hikma seeks to determine the parameters of the human mode of existence in a manner that keeps open the process which allows reasoning and acting to move forward. It's not very easy to think dynamically and realistically in this way because the mind easily habituates itself to fixed abstractions, substances, or fragments of data. While distinct in the mind, the knowing and the existing, as I shall argue, have to be taken jointly at crucial points in such a process. Thought and existence were brought into conjunction in countless ways in this whole tradition, all of which were said to be amenable to yet another mental bipolarity, unconditionality, itlaq, and contingency or delimitedness, إمكان or تقيد. Ilm al-Hikmah viewed these two mental polarities themselves as a secondary to a source fundamental yet hidden to both, because every distinction depended on a unifying but relatively hidden a priori factor. Ultimately, this factor returned to the prerogative of God, since it was through him and the openings he was said to offer that everything could be related to everything else. I use the word factor here to translate amr, which is a somewhat ambiguous word in Arabic and is often misleadingly reduced to thing. Amr can also mean command. In the philosophical literature, it often refers to God's command, be, kun, from which all other factors flow. But let's keep in mind through all this that the God of philosophy is not the God of religious practice, one of the purposes of which is to bind people to each other as a community and to other communities. I'm sure some of you are familiar with how Ibn Arabi bound these matters together. In sum, knowledge and existence cannot by themselves completely reveal the hiddenness from which everything comes to light. They do so indirectly in relation to the unknown of unknowns, which is said to manifest itself only under specifiable, knowable conditions. The openness suggested here will become clear when I come to Farghani. What we learn in Ilm al-Hikmah more generally is that this relation begins wherever one is able to speak intelligibly about a thing. There are different ways to approach a thing in its relations to other things. All are rooted in something through which all knowing and being, all beginnings and ends in their totality return to the hiddenness in God. Excuse me. But there was a keen sense of awareness that the reality of anything, whatever it is, remained hidden within itself, even as it manifested itself at various levels. This awareness mirrored the basic principle that God's knowledge of himself as he is in himself, though unknowable only to himself, is manifested in a form where a knowledge of him becomes accessible to the human being at a certain level of existence. In his influential book, Fusus al-Hikam, Ibn Arabi offers a philosophical account of existentiation or ijad, which begins with the world of appearances. He uses a singularity of threefoldness, tathlith, represented by the number 3, the first true odd number called fard, which also signifies singular individuality.
Professor Shekhar, cannot hear you.
Logically, when somebody says Ibn Arabi, he says that he sees that the two premises result only in the connective rabit. This amounts to 4 parts with respect to form, but 3 parts with respect to meaning and mana. Just as we, he says, recognize the real al-haq only by the cognizance of him through the 3. These relations can be expressed through various notational forms, but notice how Ibn Arabi reasons by association, going from number theory to logic, which is a method of representation. Logic is a method of representation, while doing so, he does this while he's speaking all along about the most consequential of things, the real, the al-haq, just the real or truth. Al-haq, this is a name for God, and the cognizance of the real. But he doesn't reason in this way for the purpose of comparing different things. At the heart of everything lies precisely this root cognizance of the real, and this in turn opens the path to other consequential things pertaining to human existence, as I will show below. Not surprisingly, threefold figures prominently as Asaad's teacher. In his Kabbalistical syllogism, to which just to show how it represents, how it can represent the interrelatedness of divine manifestations. His elaborations are far more extensive than Ibn Sina's, but it's from Ibn Sina that he took his first cue on the question of how the world may be said to be created from nothing and yet begin at a point accessible to human thinking. Why and how philosophical questions pertaining to knowledge and existence are posed, as I would like to show, explain a great deal of Ilm al-Hikma's continuous refinements during its 14th century history. Unlike the trajectory of contemporary Western philosophy and its medieval scholastic antecedents, well before the English and French languages were even born, the development of the Hikma tradition shows unusual consistency. I can't fully deal with this consistency here, but its fruit should be clear to everyone familiar with the tradition that laid the foundations of the exact and the human sciences, law, philosophy, but also the principles of civilized human relations, governance, and commerce. In short, practically everything we take for granted today and claim to value. In this long story, Ilm al-Hikma stands out as both the expression and the product of a stage of history and that has proved absolutely crucial to humanity. Unlike today's claimants to philosophy, it was also a key participant in society. This participation is evident in the case of Kunawi, not to mention the many branches of practical and theoretical tasawwuf, which acted as a social glue. It is noteworthy that one of the most eminent early exemplars of Kunawi's legacy is Fanari, the learned scholar who became the first Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam. Where is philosophy today? There's a lot of soul searching about the purpose of philosophy and even its viability as a discipline. But this questioning is frequently monopolized by the analytic and other currents, not to mention countercurrents like phenomenology and hermeneutics. Interestingly, after the Second World War, Heidegger took to speaking of the end of philosophy. By end, he meant to refer to both the purpose of philosophy and the full realization of this purpose in the contemporary period. He believed that this purpose was adumbrated as far back as the ancient Hellenic philosophers. Oddly enough, he made no mention at all of Hikma, even as a medieval interlude. Yet without Hikma, there would have been no Latin scholasticism, let alone Western philosophy. I offer these two distinct positions, the analytic on completeness and Heidegger's on the end of philosophy, as a way to divide the bulk of internal responses to the failings of philosophy on the European subcontinent. The analytic movement has been very explicit about its desire to dispense with all of philosophy's previous problematics in order to make way for the radically new ones it wished to express in the purely functional and sanitized language of this or that logical method. This is only part of its legacy, as I mentioned, because there were those who had an acute distrust of the French Cartesians' deductive method. For example, A.J. Ayer, one of the most outspoken earlier figures of the analytic movement, he insisted that the philosopher must, in his words, confine himself to works of clarification and analysis, and that the activity of philosophizing be essentially analytic. The late Kai Nielsen, a renowned teacher of philosophy when I was still an undergraduate student, argued that since philosophy could not be defined, it consisted of nothing but the analytical study of concepts. To my mind, discounting all definition of philosophy while insinuating a generic view of it based on the analytic method is rather presumptuous. However, Nielsen's more serious complaint about the non-analytic philosophers was that a good bit of what passes as philosophy is a waste of time. While I'm inclined to agree with his judgment in the local case of more generally Western philosophy, the problem is that he netted with it all past philosophy. And since philosophy to him was strictly a Western phenomenon, he never gave philosophy in the Islamic world a single thought. This bizarre oversight aside, I'm not sure how to take Ayer's own critique of the short history of Western philosophy before the analytic writers basically took over. For example, he writes, "Our charge against the metaphysician is not that he attempts to employ the understanding in a field where it cannot profitably venture, but that he produces sentences which fail to conform to the conditions under which alone a sentence can be literally significant." The analytic movement's rejection of the so-called metaphysicians was partly directed at Hegel, who, despite the problems in his system, at least tried to instill in German philosophy some sense of completion and comprehensiveness, and partly directed at Heidegger, who very few Western European intellectuals understood anyways. Heidegger wanted to return philosophy farther back than its supposed Greek antecedents, or at least the classicist interpretation of them, in order to extract something more authentic to humanity. He did so due to his contention that the intellect which developed in the West was overactive. He argued that the end of philosophy oriented itself towards incessant activity, which signified that some older philosophical enterprise was coming to a close in our time. But it was ending insofar as it was fully realizing what he assumed was its original Hellenic purpose. He described this much older philosophical enterprise as being fixated on the merely productive side of reason and existence. He found this attribute evident, for instance, in the development of philosophy into separate but interdependent sciences, which in his view constituted its legitimate completion. Philosophy, he said, was ending in the present age because it found its place in the scientific attitude of socially active humanity. This perceived outcome urged him to seek what lay behind the flux of existence, as opposed to philosophy's productive pretensions, the narrow scope of which he ascribed to a long line of so-called Western thinking. He contended that what was most thought-provoking about this thinking is that we are still thinking, not even yet thinking, although the state of the world is becoming constantly more thought-provoking. I'm using his words. True, he said, world events seem to demand rather that man act without delay instead of making speeches at conferences and international conventions and never getting beyond proposing ideas on what ought to be and what ought to be done, how it ought to be done. It may well be, he went on, that man has now acted too much and thought too little. Any philosopher who senses this agonizing dilemma surely must also recognize how thoroughly subjectivist patterns of thinking and acting, for one thing, are unraveling the very environment upon which humanity depends. You'll note that the propensity for productiveness cannot be dissociated from action, activity, etc., however, which also worked somewhat like an Achilles heel for the analytic movement in its quest for completeness in knowledge, and for good reason. Without action or practice, thinking begins to disconnect itself from the human reality. By the way, this crucial insight lay at the heart of ilm al-hikmah from the very beginning, when it was integral to falsafa, or more formally, the first philosophy. Hao Wang, one of the foremost analytic thinkers in the West, held that the search for unity and comprehensiveness was worthy of contemporary philosophy precisely on account of action. He felt sufficiently old-fashioned to argue that the analytic movement must try to achieve some measure of global definiteness, by which he meant that within the comprehensive effort to unify knowledge and action, something besides the internal coherence of an utterance had to relate to each other within each science, or in science as a whole. Let's not be misled by what he meant by action. It pertains strictly to the activity of a scientist or a theorist. He hailed logical empiricists like Carnap and Quine merely for having in his words, shared wish to adhere to the physical and other concrete or tangible objects and experiences, such as linguistic expressions and observation sentences. In his search for completeness, Leibniz was the first modern thinker to design a notational system appropriate to objects, on the grounds that technical language had somehow to mirror the structure of the world. This was the general conception of knowledge current in his time. You may recall that Hegel and Kant, for their part, assumed that rational thought reflected some rational structure of the world. In keeping with this conception, Frege devised his own notational system of science of arithmetic, geometry, and chemistry, which he took as realizations, in his words, for the specialized fields of knowledge, the sciences, at their respective levels. And from Leibniz, he accepted the idea that a notational system had to be appropriate to the objects themselves. His plan was to refine his predecessor's idea that inference had to mirror the structure of the world. There's no doubt that ilm al-hikmah entertained the idea of correspondence, but it meant but since it meant correspondence with reality and not automatically with an objectification, its approach led to very different outcomes, because what is real, hakika, by definition, did not imply the properties of a particular existence. The methods of Frege, Leibniz, and those who followed them were more relevant to the quantitative sciences, which are inductive. In philosophy, though, the rule has always been that nothing, neither object nor idea, can arise from its own matter, its properties, and so on. This ruling is frequently ignored in the contemporary approach, which systematically disregards what long philosophical tradition has already learned about comprehensiveness and completeness in the knowing and existing. And al-hikmah approaches the two poles of thinking and existing, not mechanically, but philosophically, by asking the following: if man is only part of his terrestrial world, then what is so high and noble in him that enables him to have a plenary knowledge of anything or to know anything? What makes him deserving of this knowledge? These questions cannot be fully answered inductively or based on a mechanical calculus. By the way, whenever I use the word man out of necessity in English, please understand insan, not the biological male. What can explain this discrepancy between contemporary philosophy and all other methods? How Wang tellingly drew attention to the literalism that permeates nearly every aspect of Western intellectual life, and to what he calls inhumanism, which is closely connected with it. Concerning inhumanism, contrary to the human being that that contemporary society endlessly celebrates and studies in the minutest detail, the human being vanishes from sight with the fixation on his material being and becomes like an animate or inanimate object. According to Hao Wang, in humanism and linguisticism constitute two preconceived restrictions on knowledge. He tied them to the desire to cling to what is concrete, and as he said, to the distrust in our ability to deal fruitfully in a direct manner with obscure things such as concepts, intuitions, and things in themselves. These restrictions have very much to do with how one reasons about things, including flimsy assumptions like pretending that the rational pattern in the mind must literally mirror some rational pattern existing out there. In fact, it seems rather childish to demand that the world literally be what we describe it. The dualism that this implies, in my view, is vastly different from the polarity of knowledge and existence that propelled philosophy forward since the pre-Socratics. I say this because the dynamics flowing from this polarity are most consequential for reasoning, and philosophy is nothing if it's not a form of reasoning about things, even the most ordinary things, as long as this reasoning is philosophical. When I describe reasoning as philosophical, I mean to say that nothing less than the full range of knowing and existing lies within the purview of a philosopher, not just the narrow sliver of sensory perception, observation, and empirical verification. Ilm al-Hikmah employs a wide array of terms and concepts for navigating between these two grounding poles, and Farghani is a good illustration, as we shall see. Before discussing him, let me quickly draw your attention to two sets of concepts, oneness and multiplicity, beginning and end. You'll notice that although the items in each of these two pairs go together, they are also opposites. One type of opposition intended in Ilm al-Hikmah is mutual facing, much like the two scales on a balance or mizan. It allows thinking to operate dynamically, not just deductively ad infinitum, based on abstractions or substances, or just inductively. Hegel's dialectics is not a bad example of this dynamism. The result is that while Ilm al-Hikmah is indeed a reflective science, it does not operate open-endedly in the face of the infinite varieties of things before it. Reasoning has to begin somewhere and end at a point of resolution. Ilm al-Hikmah describes this path as being almost circular, because the beginning also figures in the outcome as a beginning under a different aspect. By the same token, knowledge as a whole finds its endpoint where knowledge and existence manifest a oneness under a new aspect accessible to man from God's hidden originary oneness. In keeping with Kunawi's teachings, Farghani holds that knowledge and existence are joined together at a level known as the second ismus, or barzakh. Barzakh suggests the idea of an in-between and the joining factor that lies intermediately. While there are various kinds of barzakh, he places the junction of a unified knowing and existing at the second barzakh, not the first, because the principal role of the first barzakh is to join together the essential inclusive oneness, or ahadiyya, and the inclusive oneness, or wahidiyya, which are another instance of opposing universal concepts. But the two barzakhs do not simply follow each other. Farghani sees the second barzakh as a real form for the first barzakh, just as the second divine manifestation is a real form and light shadow for the first manifestation, which in turn is hidden and interior and real. Notice the parallel use of barzakh and manifestation. The same case as we saw with Ibn Arabi. In a secondary role, the second barzakh is attached to the contingent objects of knowledge and the names, attributes, and divine realities. But it is attached to them in a particular way because the discourse here is not about the world itself, but about where what he calls the earthy element composing the world is rooted. He explains that the earthy element is ultimately rooted in the divine command be, or kun. So the breath of the merciful, by which God pronounces this command, underlies all the divine manifestations, because it is the breath by which God articulates the roots of all things in creation. Briefly, at the furthest end point of the descending divine command, be, as conveyed through the breath of the merciful, there's a dusty, earthy element, according to Farhani, together with the construction and the commixture and so on down the descent to every created individual. In this descent, the divine command passes through all the parts of construction and commixture and is colored further by their whole, their totality. Two further points need to be mentioned. One, the divine command is circular, dawri, but only in the sense that its end is continuous with its beginning, and almost in the manner of a spiral, in fact. But let's not get into the details of this symbolism. And two, the fact that that a circle contains a center or a middle point. Farhani infers that the endpoint of the divine command likewise contains an equitable rank that comprehends all other lower equitable ranks. This equitable rank, or rutba al-i'tidaliyya, is intellected as a form for both the first and second, the first and the second barzakhs, which together make up the most interior human reality, given that the perfect man lies at the center of a circle, the insan al-kamil. This is how the equitable rank acts as a balance or mizan, a root and a source of emergence from all the intermediate levels of equitability. It's not hard to grasp the connection between the concept of barzakh, dawr, and adliya, equitability. Each of them conveys some sense of middle point. The other aspect of the relation we notice between the first and second barzakh is that every barzakh plays a delimiting function by bringing out the contents hidden in the barzakh above it. There's no need for me to lay out all the details of what is going on here. I only wanted to give you a sense of how certain things about which one reasons flow from each other and their general order of manifestation. After the first barzakh, the manifestation which begins in earnest with the joining of knowledge and existence under second consideration flows outwardly towards the exterior. Exteriority, I should add, denotes otherness, which is thought of as merely a relation with the essential, hidden, and divine source. Otherness, or ghayriyya, is of the utmost importance to philosophical reasoning because it is said to be intrinsic to everything that one reasons about, that is external to God's complete identity with himself and whatever is created therefrom. As Kunawi emphasized, insofar as man is God's other, or ghayr, he has no direct access to the divine hiddenness. Human beings, under the strict aspect of their otherness, have access only to the intermediaries, or wasa'it, on the path to the reality presenting itself to their thinking and at their level. Since the divine command follows a circular path from descent to ascent, these intermediaries themselves carry the request of the speaker to the reality, namely himself, that it reveal itself, hence the reconciliation between knower and known. Whenever we are cognizant of ghayriyya or otherness, this is where multiplicity in conjunction with oneness bears upon the philosophical discourse. One implication of this is that insofar as man has multiplicity in his physical and mental constitution, but oneness only in his root, he's capable of grasping the reality of a thing as it is in itself. He's incapable of grasping the reality of a thing as it is in itself. Instead, his faculties can grasp the thing only through the thing's relations to its properties and to other things. This, of course, is insufficient for a complete knowledge of its reality. Nevertheless, the presence of intermediaries, which incidentally include his faculties of thought, of perception, and so on, allow him to perceive the thing, whatever it may be, or for whatever purpose, in a manner presentable to him, within his means and for delimitable goals. However, the reality of the thing itself remains the same throughout its relations and properties. And so the cycle begins again. When God is the object of knowledge, he's known in his he-ness or huwiyya. That is to say, his he-ness from the vantage point of man's otherness. Knowing God in a proper way, on the other hand, requires not simply otherness, but God himself as he presents himself to his other. In this way, God's reality, unknowable in itself, remains his hidden reality that appears in different forms. Hence, a knowledge of God is considered idle or useless if it's not also stipulated by him. That is, under some condition or aspect intended for man and for his benefit. By the same token, it is understood that what a person receives of his object has to be useful or salutary for him in some discernible manner. Kunawi took great pains also to explain the paradox where the more the source object is elaborated through intermediaries, the more distant the person is from it. This is true of every kind of communication by which one seeks to convey or receive meaning through words. Despite this complication, life experience, of course, teaches us that meanings can be conveyed with a good sense, with a good measure of coherence, sometimes in very complex ways. By acknowledging this fact, Kunawi argued that one can also see, said to begin its existential articulation through the words of the breath of the merciful, from the interstices of the divine hiddenness, which dispels even the conditionality of unconditionality. Let us keep in mind how the unconditionality of divine hiddenness, which can only be referred to negatively, is related to what lies below this hiddenness, even though it emanates from it, since it is contained in the first exteriorized form of hiddenness. God's mercy, rahmah, is said to follow the pattern of this relation. Synonymous with existence, mercy as such corresponds to existence as such. Below this level of unconditionality, every other mercy corresponds to every existence. In accordance with this, ilm al-hikmah, ilm al-kalam, and usul al-fiqh have all determined that because everything in a general sense is a mercy from God, it is a mercy even when a human being finds it painful in some way. Following the rationale I established just above, mercification or rahimiyya derived from Rahim, the mercifier, corresponds to existentiation or ijad, making something exist It flows from the more general concept of Rahmaniyya, which is derived grammatically from Rahman. The point is that Rahim refers to what God does in his all-encompassing mercy. It signals an action predicated, nevertheless, on the pattern of unconditionality and delimitedness. Furthermore, the mercy bestowed upon man renders him also, and this is important, also a source of mercy towards other beings. To be clear, the dynamic between the unconditional and the limited at every level is usually analyzed according to the subjunctive relation. Subjunction, or idafa, enables the philosopher to articulate what comes to light from a thing, though primarily and originally from its original, or from its hidden source. Ultimately, this hiddenness is that of the real God, where one cannot articulate his absolute reality in itself, despite the latter's manifestations. Kunawi names two types of hiddenness. On the one hand, the hiddenness unconditioned by unconditionality itself, and on the other, the hiddenness relative to it, subjoined to it and delimiting it. What is subjunction at that second level alludes to the relational delimitation which begins to appear, but which is unconditional to whatever is below it and in turn delimited by it. Subjunction or idafa can be illustrated in simpler logical terms with relations like that of man to animal. In Arabic grammar, it also refers to the possessive case. Fundamental to the task of reasoning philosophically, it's often connected with the concept of bada'iyya, or beginningness, because it denotes what begins to be delimited, mutaqayyid. Abd al-Razzaq al-Kashani, who died in 1335, for instance, explains that bada'iyya refers to a pure subjunction that follows from exclusive oneness or ahadiyya, based on the priority of the essence of exclusive oneness relative to the presence of inclusive oneness, or ahadiyya, which is the more proper point of names, where the attributes and subjunctions consist of mental considerations. Abd al-Karim Jilani, an important source for Ibn Arabi, went on to apply daya, beginning point, devotionally or ritually, by defining it as the externalization of khuruj from what is licit, and thus what is merely within one's capacity towards what must be adhered to, hence the reference to what is familiarly given. So the term is conditional upon the preservation of the terms of the limits. For example, meaning the limit, by limits I mean hudud, like Sharia or canonical code. I mention this only to underscore the dynamic between unconditionality and delimitedness that exists in other areas where bada'iyya and bidayah were jointly applied, and where human capacity comes into play. Jurisprudence and human conduct are examples. So wanted to show that, to show how his dynamic is active, further afield in concrete questions related to the laws of society and so on. Anyways, let us review how Farghani puts order to the divine manifestation, more precisely the first manifestation that is the root of everything articulated for man within his capacity to see and understand. Excuse me. His introduction to the book, Muntaha al-Madarik, is organized according to four roots, usul, which I will not detail. He illustrates the first root, the subject of the first chapter, by quoting what God says in the Hadith. I was a treasure unknown, so I love to be known, and I created creation in order to be known. This is the Hadith. The reason he chose this Hadith is that it enables one to start with a consideration of the first level of manifestation rather than incoherently with at the ineffable hiddenness of what is unknown. He uses it to illustrate both the secrecy of God and the shift from his unknowable hiddenness to the exteriority of the names connected with what God knows about himself, and which is finally connected at some level with man in his own essence. In all this, it is God who is the ultimate finder of the treasure, since this hadith is, in this hadith, he's the speaker speaking about himself. Recall the circular beginning and end I mentioned earlier. This is how knowledge is reconciled with itself, as it must also be in philosophical reasoning, and indeed in every coherent logical operation. The exteriorization of the names from God and God's unknowable hiddenness refers to what is made known of the treasure. While the treasure always remains inside God, it points to what is made known through the forms of the many roots of the names at their levels. After the first root, all these items are stipulated in three other roots as they are found by God's others, aghyar, at their own levels. These three roots are said to be intelligible to God's others still under the aspect of God's independence, since this hadith does not directly pertain to the items of the physical world. First and foremost, accordingly, the hadith alludes in Farghani's words to the innermost hiddenness of God, the unconditionality of the most sacred essence, and the interiority of God's everlasting huwiyya or ipseity, he-ness or identity, through the concealed treasure. The innermost hiddenness of the essence contains an ordinance or hukm of eternity that is unknowable or perceivable by any designation of the root. Since it is unknowable in this way, on the one hand, this ordinance can only be negative. On the other hand, whatever man knows or beholds of a thing, despite his shortcomings, occurs through another either interior or exterior manifestation that is associated with the journey of love, or Sayd al-Hubbi. The idea of love enters the lexicon because it suggests the quest for union after separation. Farhani has in mind the union associated with the knowing and beholding when he cites the hadith where God says, I was a hearing and I was his hearing, man's hearing, and his eyesight, so he hears and sees through me. Another way to put it is that what God knows or beholds rests upon the junction between the two ordinances of the beginning and end. This is where all knowledge, beholding, manifestation, and perception are construed according to what God designates, wills, and knows of his own essence, and which is sacralized or muqaddas in respect of the essence's inclusive oneness or wahidiyya, rather than in the sense of its exclusive oneness and unconditionality. This is where positive knowledge is sacralized, yet permissible and accessible to man. Clearly, unknowability or indefiniteness at the highest consideration does not imply that nothing at all can be said elsewhere under a second consideration. But Farhani's aim is to show why and how this is so, and my account touches only some aspects of this complicated argument. In fact, one of the most complicated arguments on the subject. In short, it's only in the second consideration of oneness that essence or that is said to be one positively and not negatively, since negative here would merely refer interiorly back to the essence's indefinability. Although there are infinite possible considerations, they are all fixed by the root to the single real and inclusively one name that God himself stipulates, and this name is known to man as Allah. The contents of the treasure are connected with the part of the hadith that says, I love to be known, because this hadith has to do with the names that are most proper to God. There are, by contrast, names that are shared by God and man as generally recognized in Kalam. Hence, excuse me. Hence, with regard to the phrase "I loved" and "I love to be known," Farani holds that it refers to the root inclination or mail that conducts from the concealment to exteriorization, and what is first designated as such is oneness itself and therefore God. In the hadith, the phrase "to be known" in "so I love to be known" alludes to the exteriorization of concealment. In this respect, whereas only God knows this hiddenness, the names are known both by him and by those who are perfected when they are raised to that level through designation and the first manifestation. The perfection meant here is the essential perfection initially imparted by the first manifestation, which essential perfection carries the most elevated meaning. It carries the most elevated meaning. The words "I love to be known," which are said to confirm this, subsume the gems or substances, jawahir, of the names of attributes. The cognizance of these attributes is permissible for every perfect person confirmed. They also encompass the names of acts, the benefits and effects of which are so far still general. While the words themselves are not specific to any person in the physical world, their ordinance nevertheless pertains to the ontic levels, or ontic, by ontic I mean kauniya, that constitute both the venues of completion of the name's perfection and the hiddenness of that, the meaning of which is hidden. And this, Farani says, is indicated by God's words, "and I created in order to be known." This is how, at any rate, the first manifestation subsumes the perfection, the reality of which implies the attainment of what must be perfected, which is of two types. One is what is summatively perfect, inclusively one and confirmed at one rank, but also at a secondary level where life is designated by way of the name ever living one, or al-Hayy, which name signifies the essential independence of God's perception of the essence and every other self-perception according to inclusive oneness, or wahidiyya, through all the said considerations, forms, meanings, etc. The second type of perfection is that of the names, and it permeates the elaborations of the names and the realities. It's called the self-exteriorization of the essence, because it consists of the elaborated considerations of the essence and the realities of the essence's distinctions at various levels according to relational otherness. It remains that the reality of the name's perfection signifies the exteriorization of the essence to itself according to both its universality and its junction of all that concerns it. As a self-beholding, Farghani emphasizes, this perfection is true on the condition that the locus of exteriorization, being universal, joins all the essences, individuations in the act, or afrad, individuations, afrad. In this unique aspect, the locus of exteriorization can then be said to be the real perfect man, al-insan al-kamil al-hakiki, wahdani. When self-exteriorization comes into play, however, every one of the individual loci of exteriorization is also distinguished as the exteriorization of inclusive oneness for each individual to itself and or himself to others and to others like it. I realize how difficult it is to follow my expose of Farghani, but as you can see, the totality of designations and consideration aspects he mentions is not interconnected mechanically like a great chain. One reason they're not, but which I've not yet noted, is that they're expressed in terms derived from the natural language of divine speech, not symbolic logic. The master concepts we have reviewed are all derived from words found in hadiths, which convey meanings in a living Arabic language. Natural language is, of course, the prime vehicle used in human communication to convey meanings like unlike mathematical symbols, because words have a unique capacity to communicate almost everything encountered in human experience. There's no doubt that Ilm al-Hikma employed various systems of mathematical logic as well, and even algebraic equations. Tusi used them to explain the emanation of the intellects from each other and the rise of multiplicity through the oneness manifested in that very multiplication. Whatever the method, the core reasoning is intended to demonstrate how the multiplicity of what is known begins from what is one and ends with what is one under another aspect of a self-beholding. This knowing or beholding is amenable to the metaphor of love because love suggests the seed of all separation and union, and it is out of the seed that man embarks on a path of knowledge and existence. From the root of the second barzakh, we saw, since the first barzakh is where things can only be referred to negatively, not positively. A formal logic cannot possibly convey such richness by cleansing language of its human accretions, as Frege planned to do in order to safeguard the pure logic of an argument. One kind of notational systems that were employed besides those I have mentioned so far is the notational systems are quite numerous. Ibn Arabi, Tilmisani, and others, and Kunawi Kunawi in particular wrote a philosophical interpretation of the Fatiha called Ijaz al-Bayan, in which he assigned particular values to each value in the Basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. To which, to the letter B, in the expression Bism in Bismillah, he assigned the beginning of everything in the knowing and existing, and assigned other values for the remaining letters. Unfortunately, some Western academics today describe this method as part of some occult science. I can't tell you how wrong-headed this characterization is. Kunawi applied this system also to the words found in the Fatiha, explained the relations of those words based on the grammatical rules of the Arabic language, not because language somehow determined existence, but because the Quran was like a window to the human code, to the human mode of existence in all its dimensions. Through the Quran, man who in a sense also embodied the Quran, was said to embark on a journey of life, namely the world that opens up for him. This is why Kunawi recalled repeatedly that the Quran's first chapter, to which he devoted his book Ijaz al-Bayan, and which is said to summarize the Quran, yet is part of it, is called Al-Fatiha, the opening. What is thinking? It takes years to master the reasoning methods and objectives of ilm al-hikmah, but learning also carries certain risks. One reason that Kunawi expressed his reluctance to expand too much on his explanations, at least for the purpose of his book, was precisely their complexity. Complexity gives rise to incomprehension and communication of what is really intended. His wariness did not, however, induce him to compensate by trying to recover the completeness of knowledge in the manner of the analytic movement by trying to reduce everything to its bare logical elements. Nor did philosophy to him require one to be totally unconcerned with the world, as I will show briefly in the case of Farabi. Ilm al-Hikmah operates elusively by pointing to something with a purpose, either an object, thing, or another sign. The tasks it assumes have to do with determining under what conditions and in what senses the realities of things may be said to be grasped, as well as measured piecemeal with the limited human faculties. Because the realities of things could not be known solely according to the 10 categories through the ordinary faculties, the central question remained, what is the most direct path to the wisdom that mirrors the wisdom of God, in whom everything begins and is reconciled? But the completeness sought by philosophers in the knowing and existing is incremental in a more fundamental respect, since it requires perfecting by degrees and by stages in both the mind and in the course of living. The living condition, the limiting condition in this knowing and existing is one's own capacity by which one is able to arrive at a realistic understanding and assessment of the value and or usefulness of this knowledge. Some types of knowledge are more important than others. Some bear fruit, while others are sterile, vain, etc. All in all, life envelopes thinking. Otherwise, thinking would simply close in on itself instead of reaching higher. In a word, although people live in a world, they are not of it. This is why Sadra held that the thinking faculties develop in the thick of life, where human beings by nature must cooperate towards goals they cannot attain without verbalizing their thoughts through language. In arguing this, he did not need to reduce human beings and their thoughts to the material circumstances of their life, while ignoring their purposefulness. Farabi, who died in 951, was the first, however, to depict the path of thinking on the large canvas of the meta-history of wisdom and the city of excellence. An idea that had some superficial antecedents in Plato's Republic. And it is thanks to him that Ibn Khaldun founded an empirical special science of society and civilization, an accomplishment for which modern scholars have crowned him the founder of social science and the study of civilization. This was possible because Farabi showed how the principles he laid out for philosophy also underpin the socio-political existence of man, though he didn't do this in the manner of a political scientist. Turning to the primordial centrality of man in the knowing and existing, just as we saw earlier, he proposes a far-ranging thesis about civilization, Umran or Madaniya. He closely associated civilization with the basic philosophical question of beingness, or mawjudiyya, the main subject matter of the first philosophy, and the most basic one for the thinking human being. He argues that human beings begin by examining the things that exist, so mawjudat, before pursuing what lies ba'd al-tabaiyat, what is beyond natural things. Therefore, they begin with what they are able to perceive in the world they inhabit. What is beyond natural things can mean their presence in the human mind, or perhaps the things, realities, which, while not physical, man seeks to understand beyond the particular properties of the things. This means that what man sees beyond the existing things perceivable through his senses is not what those senses initially present to him through his faculties. In the path of every knowing, formally speaking, he has to move from whatever he knows partially to what is yet to be known. Farabi understands that knowledge cannot be separated from its purpose for human beings. In a sense, it cannot be indifferent to man, who remains with and at the very center of all relations. He holds further that what is human in things, or ashya insaniya, is philosophically significant insofar as its realization makes possible the felicity of nations and seated peoples in the first worldly life and in the afterlife. Man's felicity in this world is to pursue the highest possible state of perfection for any existent to attain, even though bodily this cannot be fully achieved, since the next world is a true final end. What remains after excelling in the pursuit of theoretical knowledges is that things be actualized, بالفعل, and made to exist as mawjuda, being mawjuda, by what they can bring forth in accordance with what the theoretical knowledges or sciences determine. There is in ilm al-hikmah an acute awareness that a perfection of the mind, like theoretical wisdom, requires completion with something on the order of practical wisdom, as Sadra argued. Without this having to mean that philosophy must or is qualified to teach how to build houses or boats. That inquiry into being as such, or mawjudiyya, of the first philosophy requires no particular practical outcome. Sadra distinguished between, on the one hand, the theoretical knowledge of things, the existence of which in principle was attached to the corporeal matters or movements, and on the other, knowledge into those which were. Theoretical science in the first category, as Ibn Sina before him also showed, had the objective of arriving at an informed opinion or a belief. He noted that that could be expected from theory was that it points by ishara to the realities of things which came within man's purview. As man articulated his being in the world, however, so he entered into relation with whatever was of concern to him. In this task, thoughts which were internal to the soul, kayfiyya, nafsaniyya, must prepare the soul for an active intellective beholding, or mushahada aqliya, and therefore the representation or hikaya of a thing's universal reality. However, this representation or telling is not about things in their ontic beingness or kawniyya, in the way that human beings going about their business, know about the world. The original notion of the practical, which was central to Farabi's ideal of the city of excellence, seems to have persisted down the centuries. It required one simply to gain foresight into the consequences of one's informed opinion. That a theoretical philosophy of being and the principles it lays down should be useful in the polis is, however, elementary, because in as much as, it's elementary in as much as the inquiry into being had to be conducive to the realization of wisdom and therefore to the welfare of man. Usefulness and practice serve to complete knowledge at very different, sometimes contradictory levels, based on the reasonable assumption that truth could not be of idle interest to man. Let me now conclude by saying Ilm al-Hikmah employs words and language heuristically instead of seeking literalist interpretations of the world or knowledge that has to be indifferent to man just to be objective or true. It seems to me that in its eagerness to sharpen its problem-solving techniques, contemporary philosophy must have forgotten along the way how to pose philosophical questions and why. Philosophy before our time was treasured as sermons. It was never designed to replace religion nor to re-engineer society by dictating particular beliefs like modern ideologies by design seek to do. What I presented here is only a tiny portion of Ilm al-Hikmah, a very complex tradition with a long history. But it's not only its complexity that ought to occupy our minds. It's possible to understand how it opened up new paths, and this is very important. This is noticeable from one philosopher to the other, from one century to the other. I like to compare this philosophical tradition to a wellspring that never ceases to give, and keeping in mind that philosophy is meant to guide and not to replace life itself. Thank you very much for your patience, and I apologize for the length of my paper.
Okay,
The floor
thank
is to you, sir.
Yes, thank you, Professor Shekhar, for your presentation. Yes, your presentation includes very different terminology. Some of us are familiar to these terminologies, some of us are not. I think there are some questions. Before taking the question, do you want to pause or shall we move on to Q&A section?
No, that's fine. I'm okay. My voice was kind of dying down, but this always happens.
Okay,
no problem.
right. Yes, audience, if you want, you can ask. Yes, please, Victoria Holbrook. Please open your microphone.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
I'm Victoria Holbrook. Hi. Thank you so much. This is a great gift. I greatly appreciate your putting your talk within the overall framework of what philosophy is and what it is today and what it's not. I'm interested in asking a more historical question. And I apologize if it's not really at the heart of what you're talking about. In your paper title, you have the word post-classical, and recently it's been used a lot to talk about actually post-translation movement philosophy, right? I mean, although people use the word Hikmah before that.
Sorry, you mean post-classical or post-Western or postmodern?
Post-classical Islamic philosophy lately, in the last years or so, has been used to mean post-translation movement, post-falsafe, post-philosophe, you know, Sotro Ardian, say. Right? I mean, don't you find that to be?
I'm not sure. Well, there's falsafa, which is a common
Yeah, falsafa,
term
yeah,
for earlier philosophy, but
right.
you know, it's
Okay,
just but falsafa continued to be used.
yeah. Okay,
Anyways,
okay, that's
anyway,
not the question.
animal. Yeah.
Okay, now you said that without Hikma, there would be no scholastic philosophy, European Latin scholastic philosophy. And you talked a lot about German philosophy. Now I'm wondering about the connection between the two. I'll just tell you, you know, when I read German romantics and German idealists, so Hegel, I have this weird feeling that I'm reading Hikma misunderstood. You know, that somehow even Araby, like, or, you know, it's sort of like they didn't get it or something, but they're sort of like trying or something, you know. And I was just wondering how you see this. You know, you said there'd be no scholasticism without Hikma. I mean, we know that the early Latin translations were mostly interested in Aristotle and science, right? Not Hikma. And famously, I mean, the Encyclopedia Britannica still says that, you know, Islamic philosophy, unfortunately, you know, ended, you know, in 1000 or so, you know, and the Muslims turned to mysticism, you know. But that's, you know, that's what people thought for a long time. So I'm interested in why you say there'd be no scholasticism without Hikma. And if you can talk about it, how that gets into German philosophy. I mean, or doesn't, or I don't know.
Sure.
Sorry.
Well, the reason I say there couldn't be Latin scholasticism without Hikma or Ilm al-Hikma is because even Aristotle, even when he was read in Greek,
Oh, I
he
see.
was read through the prism of what was learned from Farabi and Ibn Sina and so on. It's impossible. I mean, Aristotle was to some degree read before in earlier scholasticism, you know, even before Islam, the Islamic calendar.
Mhm.
But are we really talking about scholasticism or simply, you know, Christian theology of the Western Church? And but you know, we shouldn't. This is the Western Church was what came late, a little bit later, because the Christianity was a bit more unified back then. But that's basically what I mean. Anyways, it's through the prism of Ilm
Yeah,
al-Hikmah.
right.
And it's impossible to understand, I mean, read Latin scholasticism, in my opinion, without also reading the subtext of Ilm al-Hikmah. Everything was learned through that. And Greek was
My doorbell's ringing.
become more and more widespread. So the learning of Greek and Latin, of course, was more a learned language and so on. But anyways, I think I'll wait for her to come back to answer the bit about Hegel and German idealism, because I think she also raised that question. I don't know if there's someone else who would like to ask something else. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking.
Okay, we can. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, she's back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. And would you say that, you know, I mean, the Aristotle that the Latins read, you know, was through Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. But they were also reading Aristotle through Plato, right? Through the attempt to harmonize
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
So,
It's
I mean,
very complicated.
there's this Platonic thing that somehow makes
Yes.
it play, right?
Yes, of course.
That's
because
what I'm interested in. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, that's
Yes, it's of course, you know, the Platonic, what we call the Platonic element is there because we talk about the Aristotelian tradition, but it's really a commentary tradition that was inherited in the Islamic period, and that's basically, you know, Alexander Aphrodisias, and so very crucial figures in a long line of philosophy in the sense, which I prefer not to call it Western at all, because Greece. Even today, I mean, I'm part
Yeah,
Greek
yeah, yeah, yeah.
myself. I'm not part of that kind of lingo. It's but anyways, it's a commentary tradition, and it has very strong Platonic elements, of course. And Aristotle was elaborated, let's say, through all kinds of ancient philosophers, and then again in the course of those commentaries and so on. So it's a very complex and rich tradition, and this basically what gave us what we know about philosophy. But I also always argue it allowed us to develop a conception of science also, and hence the modern world as we know it. I mean, it's a modern world. We tend to think of it in from the lens of the outcome, the final outcome, which is what we have today. But it's really a very long process of that involved many different actors, and these actors go, you know, they also involve people in the traditions in South Asia and China. You know, sciences also were influential in the Islamic world. The Islamic world stood, you know, middle way into they were intermediary. They connected all kinds of traditions and so on. And the Mongols just intensified this invasion, just intensified this cultural interchange. But I don't know if you want me to say something about Hegel, and you also
Yeah,
mentioned this is
please
completely
do.
different.
I mean,
Yeah.
how does that relate to scholasticism having been not being able to happen without Hikma? How does German philosophy relate to that? I mean, because like I said, I just keep thinking, wait a minute, there's something going on here. Was there some, you know, like maybe in the Counter-Reformation, the Habsburg border with the Ottoman Empire, you know, maybe there was some, you know, non-textual something or other happened. I don't know.
Well, I take German philosophy, which has roots in German mysticism, but I take German philosophy, let's say contemporary German philosophy, in around the period more or less of Hegel and Kant and so on. I take it as a beginning. I don't because I tend to view history of European philosophy from Heidegger's viewpoint, and he takes it almost like a correct of scholasticism. Because scholasticism just flew off in different directions, and it is very fragmented and kind of erratic also. But so is modern philosophy. But I take German philosophy, which is really the beginning of European philosophy, in my view, as a beginning. But as a beginning, you know, a beginning is always an end to something. Also, René Descartes is very much influenced by scholasticism, Latin and Suarez, and all these. Suarez came later, of course, but Suarez was an influence in philosophy in Europe, but it helped to elaborate certain currents in Europe and so on. But this is how I view German philosophy. It's a response to what was perceived as failings in the medieval period in scholasticism, and it took off in this way. But I'm just always amazed by all the parallels that I find in Hegel, and especially Heidegger much later, but Hegel, because he talks about Hegel is like most of philosophy in Europe, Central and Western Europe, is focused on the sciences. which are, depend on inductive reasoning. And Hegel, the philosophy of history, it's not really a philosophy, it's an interpretation of history. And inductive reasoning is, I won't go into it, but it has a place in Ilm al-Hikma, and they do follow certain patterns of inductive reasoning, but because deductive reasoning is completely inadequate anyways. Deductive reasoning is just a way of representing an argument, but so is inductive inference, but deductive reasoning is kind of mechanical, where inductive reasoning is not. Anyways, that's the way that's why when you read Hegel, you say, well, it says it's like Hikma, I'm sorry, Ilm al-Hikma misunderstood, whenever you read Hegel. And maybe that's the reason you do feel this way, is because Hegel is really focused on science, not reality. Reality in Ilm al-Hikma is not an existing thing. Reality has no individual properties and so on. Anyways, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. I think, Kerem Hoca, do you have any question? You raise your hand.
I do, thank you.
Yes, please.
Unfortunately, for some reason, I can't find the raise hand button on my, but
No problem, no problem.
Thanks for the talk. I mean, it wasn't easy for me to follow through. There's quite a bit of, I mean, other than being long, I don't know this literature that much, but I do have a question mainly of clarification regarding what is the point, right? So someone might listen to the talk and say, so what Professor Shakir is saying is that Hikma kinds of philosophy, this way of understanding philosophy as Hikma, this is how philosophy should be. Or this is what really philosophy is. The other stuff is not really philosophy. They are failures, they're incomplete, they are distortions of some sort. Or would you say that all you're saying is that, no, I mean, analytical philosophy, for example, your main, let's say, counterpart here, is one way of doing philosophy. The Hikma style or form is another way of doing philosophy. Both are philosophy. And maybe one way to drive the point home using the last sentence you used, you said philosophy is meant to guide, not to replace life itself, right? Well, someone might say very simply, of course, right? We'll agree. Yes, it's not supposed to replace life, but guidance is not one thing. I mean, there are many ways to be guided. For example, Hikma will guide us maybe in understanding the transcendent in our life, right? But we also need other kinds of guides. We need the kinds of things that guide us through life and just solving problems that we have, and that kind of guidance might not necessarily require understanding transcendence as much as it requires understanding, just like as if developing maps for social disagreements, let's say, or personal disagreements, how to organize society and try to follow the map and see what works, what doesn't work. I mean, what is your position? Are you saying there's only one kind of guidance and it's the Hikma kind of guidance, and without the transcendent, there is no philosophy? Or you're saying another way?
No, I'm sorry if I gave that impression. Not at all. It's of course, philosophy is philosophy, and it's not for everyone. And there are different ways of seeking guidance in life. I mean, philosophy seeks to do something very different than the ordinary in life. And even when it looks at ordinary things, it looks at ordinary things through from a completely different viewpoint. So, but the reason I emphasize, I mean, my topic was really to explain the method of philosophy. and method and goals of philosophy. So I got into some detail in this because what I explained is basically what Ilm al-Hikma explains about itself. It's a very self-conscious tradition. And this is something that we often forget too. It's a very self-conscious, and that's why I always say that you don't need other models of explanation that are foreign to it in order to explain what it's trying to say. And I mean, I have all the respect for phenomenology and hermeneutics and people who really get into this this sort of thing. It's not part of my interest, but I respect other people's views of what philosophy is and should be. Philosophy is, philosophical debate is diverse, and there's no need to impose one. But what I was trying to impress upon you also in this lecture is that contemporary philosophy, I'm not just saying Western philosophy or this or that, contemporary philosophy, and this includes people who think they're doing Islamic philosophy, but in fact they are not, Contemporary philosophy in all its, as a whole, has failed, in my opinion, and has failed in tandem with the failure of modern culture, as we see all around us. So we see chaos all around us. So I try to connect these two things because philosophers do live in the same world. Men and women live in the same world. We live in, and we have to be realistic, not realistic to the point where we simply are trying to eat each other, devour each other, in a competition in the world, in a jungle, law of the jungle, but realistic in understanding what the world signifies, what it should tell us about what we're doing, what we've been thinking. So I try to impress this on you that contemporary philosophy, its failure is a function of the failure of the modern world that we all created together. I don't take modern society or the modern world as a product of Western Europe alone or Islam alone. It's a product of a long historical process. And we've come this far now, since the last century and a half or so. Western Europe and the United States have dominated the world. No longer than that. That's all it's been, a century and a half. Before that, we have 2 more centuries of colonization and so on. But it didn't, Western Europe just didn't pop onto the world scene as I mentioned. It's just there's a long process. And it began maybe 500 years ago when after medieval society accumulated enough capital, which of course was thanks to certain technological breakthroughs in Andalusia, in agriculture, especially, but other technological imports from the Islamic world and products. The cotton became extremely important, as you know, and it led to the Industrial Revolution. Where did cotton come from? It came from the Indian subcontinent, and this was where the idea of factory, in fact, had been going on for a long time. And then you have the paper, production of paper in the Islamic world. The paper was invented in China, but the industry itself became took an industrial scale. And the idea of factory, and not the modern factory, but the idea of a factory was borrowed from there. In England, they went around the world. They said, this is what we're going to do. And they started organizing factories and introducing and improving the idea of factory. Pretty soon we have, they displaced the whole countryside and the, house industries. I forget the term. But because cotton was already introduced, and there were all kinds of industries dispersed all over the countryside, and all this population was uprooted and became a proletariat. So we have a large army of proletariat who work the factories.
Yeah, may I
Go
just
ahead.
quickly follow up? I mean, I'm sympathetic to the assessments that contemporary and more generally, I would say, let's say modern, late modern or postmodern philosophy has failed, and that the failure, or it has gone away significantly, and the failure is related or is a product or reflects a failure on the cultural level, on the social level. Okay. Now, similarly, I would assume that you will say that the Hikma tradition it was itself also a reflection of the social level. It did not create a certain, it was itself a byproduct of a certain way of life, a form of life, a social way of living. So the question is, and this is, I think, a question that philosophers today, irrespective of how we understand philosophy, and intellectuals in general should ask themselves, right? So given this failure, how do we move forward? Do we work on improving the social cultural base so that in the future we might have better, let's say, philosophy that gets reflected from that society? Or do we work on reintroducing a different way of thinking, hoping that it's gonna generate a different kind of society? I mean, the reason why I'm saying this is I see one way I can see the great benefit of looking at Hikma as a tradition or something that was present and we don't find it in the same strength and vigor, is that it gives us today, those of us who are, living the crisis, give us the idea or the hope that things can be different. And when things were different, a different mode of thinking was present. So when we look at, if you are in a crisis, you are looking for, a way out. And typically we look backwards, right? Because there is no forward, right? You cannot think of forward out of thin air. So you look backward, and this is maybe it can motivate us to look at not the Hikmah philosophy as such, as much as to the social, cultural foundations which Hikmah reflected, and then say, okay, maybe we should try to move society towards this direction. Is this something, am I completely off the mark here, or at least what do you think?
It's a very excellent question, and it's very important. But you see, to answer you directly, the last part of your question, do we need to begin at the social level and so on? I discount completely any kind of thinking that revolves around the idea of engineering society. That has been a complete disaster for everyone. I mean, you look at the 20th century, that's all it's a long trail of bodies, whether, Soviet system or and I'm not communist bashing or anything like that. It's just an observation. Soviet system, the Nazi system, the capitalist system in the West, and it's just one model after another, one hubris after another. So, but you ask an extremely important question. What comes first, the egg or the goose? Philosophy, the idea, or what philosophy reflects and is born in. We do live in a reality that we share as human beings, and I never thought that ideas can determine existence on its own. It's just a very abstract way of saying nothing, really, because this is why I made a point of mentioning Kunawi and the Tasawwuf tradition in general, that they took part in society. Philosophers were part of society, from the upper to the lower echelons. I mean, maybe philosophers, the most sophisticated philosophers were not, didn't mingle enough with with the common people, but they did actually. In Konya is an excellent example of this. They had there's a circle included Rumi, and so on. They mingled all kinds of people with Christians, Armenian Christians, and people from Greece and so on. People did mingle a lot together, and so you know, philosophy is intermeshed, I think, with society. The society that gives birth to it, birth to philosophical ideas, is also a society that's influenced by ideas, because human beings they're not just robots, you know, determined by circumstances. So they think, they feel, they interact, they invent, they do all sorts of things together. So that's so you know, you can't really, it's in our minds, we separate the two abstractly, but in fact, when you look at reality, they're joined. So we start from this what we see in front of us, something that's joined. You know, we join these two poles, let's say, and we think about it and reflect, but we have to return to that, you know, eventually. You know, we make all kinds of distinctions, but these are all in our minds, you know. And philosophy, I feel, you can't separate philosophy. But you know, ilm al-hikmah is too long to disregard and just to put alongside other philosophical traditions. As I mentioned before, contemporary philosophy is a very recent event, and it's a product of a historical process. And you know, I added the value judgment that it's also a failure, the same failure as our modern culture. So, you know, putting Hikmah alongside contemporary philosophy, I just can't wrap my mind around it. I'm not saying that Ilm al-Hikmah is the only possible way to think. There are other traditions, you know, in India, non-Muslim segments of the population that have a, you know, they really treasure their philosophical tradition, you know. Buddhism and Hinduism, and China has the same thing, and Confucianism maybe a little weaker today than in India, but you know, these are long. And Latin America, I mean, we're organizing a symposium for a dialogue between Latin American and Islamic philosophies, and it's very diverse. It's not just, you know, Latin America doesn't just have colonial ideas borrowed from Western Europe. It's very rich and diverse, you know. So this is the world we live in. Anyways, I hope I answered. I don't want to keep talking too long. Maybe others have.
I'll ask later. I don't want to take you know, others. Yeah.
Yes, please. I think there are some different questions. Dr. Özkan wrote a question on the chat because he's in the library. He cannot speak loudly. He asked, what is the difference between Ilm al-Hikmah and Tasawwuf? Are they different from each other as to different discipline, or are they the same?
There is a distinction to be made, but one should not get carried away with it, because those who take part in these two patterns, let's call them for now, also purport to be talking about the same things. So, but from different perspectives. Ilm al-Hikmah is really the science of philosophy. It's which is not a practice. You see, remember we said philosophy cannot replace life, but Tasawwuf is a little different, because it requires you to practice to some extent what you learn from. Of course, it's complicated, you know. We did not learn from philosophy, but what philosophy clarifies about your life and about the Sharia, or about the Sharia is just simply the law of the land, and what different aspects of your life, what philosophy clarifies about different aspects of your life. But you know, this is just my word, philosophy, because a Sufi is, you know, of course, tries to keep at bay books in certain when he or she is in a certain state of mind and orientation in the world. So books and ideas and abstractions and so on are the last thing that a Sufi wants in certain moments of his or her life, you know. So there is a distinction to be made, but I think the only way I explain it really, because tasawwuf is so huge and you know it's old, it predates I think philosophy, the science of philosophy. The only way I can explain the relationship is that ilm al-hikmah is a science, simply you know, simply said, is it's a science or a discipline of, not science in the exact science sense today, but a discipline. And it requires thinking. It relies on thinking. But thinking has many patterns also. There's Ibn Sina and Falsafa, the early philosophy and so on, which was criticized later by you know, the greatest of all philosophers, you know, so many of them I can't even think, but let's go to right to the end, Mullah Sadra. You know, thinking is a very important part of the philosophical enterprise, but it's not the only. It doesn't, you know, thinking has to be constructed, and it can be deduced, and it can be you know, gathered from what we see, what we sense all around us. It has to be constructed in order for it to be a guide of light. So.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shaker. I think there are different questions. Yes, Ishak Hoca, please.
Thank you, Professor Anthony Shaker, for the presentation. I would like to turn to classical Islamic philosophical tradition, and my question will be relevant with the goal of this tradition generally. When we look at the text of Muslim philosophers in the classical period, I mean by the classical period, mainly I am focused on 10th century, 11th and 12th century. So some common points stand out, especially in the effort to reach absolute or perfect knowledge. In my opinion, the main motivation of the efforts to reach the perfect knowledge, or as you mentioned, like completeness or perfect knowledge, within the philosophical tradition, and the main goal was, in my opinion, first to gain advantage in the political struggle, namely will to power. And the second, there must be probably a lot of other motivations, but first and second, the second is to legitimize and justify an ethnic, political, or a moral position rather than to connect with the reality or haqiqah. So in this respect, when we look at the classical period, social order and stability were more important than individual perfection. As we've seen in the Far East, like Buddhist tradition, for instance, we can find some individual perfection. But in this era and in this geography, the social order and stability were more important. Just look at the Ghazali's book, Al-Munqiz min ad-Dalal, for instance. However, the conflicts, there were conflicts around the caliphate and the theological sects, and those conflicts continued up until time. Now, in this context, namely the socio-political context, can we say that the Hikma tradition is not qualitatively different from other counterparts, including Western counterparts? Because the main motivation was first politics and then some socio-economic gainings. That was my question.
Thank you. You know, there are different ways to approach this important question. It's of course, in the early period in Islamic calendar, it was crucial to establish some kind of political order because there were so many different movements and very sincere people, other less sincere, and so on. You know how human beings behave, and so it was important to codify not just the the law, but codified thinking, and of course it's reflected in theology, kalam, and so we have a proliferation of different branches of learning in the religious sciences, but then philosophy, of course, grew and so on. But you focus on an important aspect, which is the political makeup and what and its composition. What is it? Is it Arab? Of course, this Arab element disappeared very quickly from after the Umayyad, and Abbasid came, and it's is more composite and so on. But we have different. This is to me is a classical period where there's this transition from a tribal conception that grew in the Arabian Peninsula after the Prophet, because the Prophet, it was complete in a sense. The community, the Ummah was complete in a sense, but it wasn't complete by reference to what happens later, because there were other considerations that had to be taken into account. So what is the Ummah, and in relation to people who are not Muslim and so on. So very quickly, this ethnic racial element, not racial because race is a very modern concept. This ethnic or tribal element disappeared pretty quickly, and people were talking in Islamic terms. But when you think about Islam, it's also has a general and a specific meaning. Islam is submission to God. Submit everything is the whole of creation submits to God, and then you have a very specific meaning that relates to those who choose to do it in a particular way as a community, not just as individuals, but of course beginning with the individual, but as a community. So they began to create rituals around them, and based on the original community in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Prophet was living, and you have all kinds of things, intervening factors, and so on. But this question is never answered in full, and you can't have because history continues, and there's always this tension between what is our identity, and how do we define ourselves within certain, in modern times we define it in a certain within a certain territory, which is always the case, but suddenly we have it all crystallized into nation states, So now we have a problem of imposing the will of one part of society upon the will of the rest, or minority, and so on. So, but there's nothing absolute. And this quest for absolute knowledge also, as I try to convey in my paper, when you speak of absolute things, these are abstractions also. Not abstractions, but you can only refer to them negatively, as this is unconditional, and so on. In a second consideration, if you go by my paper, there are things that are defined more positively. So the hiddenness of God is hidden, absolute, and unknown. You can only refer to it as negatively. So you can always say he is not, nothing can reach him, and so on. This is always with all these negatives. What the real, or God, Haq, manifests of himself is always manifested under certain, under specifiable conditions. This is how philosophy views the situation. It's manifested under certain aspects, at certain level, at different levels, and so on. It's not manifested in itself completely. Of course, if God had manifested himself on a mountain, as the Quran says, the mountain would have collapsed. That's that sort of thing. It's a metaphor for something along those lines. So there's nothing really absolute in life, because life there's no absolute. The only absolutes are things in our minds. We separate things because it's easier to think in absolutes and in substances and in bits of data and so on. We kind of try to reconnect them and so on. But life is not like that. It begins like an egg, and it grows, and it goes back under a different aspect to the oneness that it sort of, every operation of the mind proceeds in this way. Logic, if you think logically, you begin somewhere with the premises and you conclude somewhere else in a unity of thought. Anyway, so everything in life, but there are different ways, and philosophy tries to understand the root of all this, of all these manifestations of the mind, of life around us. But anyways, I don't know if I'm answering your
Thank you.
question, but there are no absolutes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shekhar, for your answer. Unfortunately, yeah, 2 hours already passed, and we are out of time actually. So I think we can. I'm not sure actually, Professor Shekhar, if you want, we can take a last question. I have actually many questions, but especially about completeness, circularity, guiding life. If we guide, the philosophy guide life, what is the difference between ideology? Yes, there are many questions actually to be discussed, but unfortunately,
we can continue. We can continue for a while if you like. I don't mind. It's up to you, really, if you have a time limit.
Okay, we can.
As I said, I have to leave eventually, but let's go on if you want, if you're able to do it.
Okay,
it's a good opportunity.
We can take another question, last question. So if you want to ask a question, we can take. Otherwise,
go ahead. Erdal Hoja, you go
okay,
ahead.
thank you. Yes. Well, actually, there are many questions, but I will ask only one of them. You said actually Kerim Hoca and also Ishak Hoca emphasized the same point, but I want to reformulate this question from my point of view. If the philosophy or philosophical thinking is the product of society, so if we live in modern society, which lost the completeness, perfection, etc., so how can we create a philosophy that lead us to this perfection? In other words, completeness. Because as far as I realize, in order to achieve perfection, or to go to have completeness, we need also circularity.
Circularity?
Yes, because especially in when you talk about Hikma, you said there are some concepts, their characteristic refer to especially middle point, means the end includes the beginning includes ends, and yes, there is a circularity. If
circularity, okay, yes,
yes, circularity. So especially concerning these two concepts, completeness and circularity. In this condition, I mean, in modern condition, contemporary condition, is it possible to have this completeness and circularity by doing philosophy? If the philosophy is product of current society, and if the society allows this quality.
Well, let's begin by trying to understand what tradition, which is time tested, has done. Let's start by this. But as far as completeness is concerned, I don't think it's possible. I mean, it's been tried heroically by the analytic movement, to arrive at a completeness but as good proved mathematically, a complex system begins to contradict itself because you constantly.
Well, I can't hear Professor Shekhar. Do you hear guys?
Rules in order to put in the mind,
Is he frozen?
Pardon me?
Okay, sometimes, we cannot hear you. Okay, yes.
Oh, you can. But completeness cannot be achieved through their mind because as Goodell proved mathematically, a complex system begins to create or generate self-contradictions, inside the system, because you have to introduce specific rules to justify every operation. So the whole system begins to fragment. And as far as completeness is concerned, and that's why I mentioned in the paper the emphasis is on istikmal. I mean, when ilm al-hikmah refers to al-kummal, the perfected ones and so on, these are figures that have completed, have achieved a certain completion at a certain stage, because completion is part of life too. Things begin and they end, they are completed in a certain way and continuously in this fashion. So when you talk about completion as a whole, it's impossible, because only God knows the complete truth of the universe. We can't explain the fact that it exists without reference to somebody or God, the source that knows the whole thing in some way. But this is our human way of talking about the mystery of life itself, And so, but without this mystery, I mean, human life just fragments. I mean, I'm not saying that we all have to believe in God and so on. This is sort of thing, but somebody who doesn't believe in life also, still has to conforms in order to survive to certain patterns of human living. And how you explain these patterns, well, you can go deeper and deeper or higher. There are various traditions that explain it. I'm not saying that there's only one way to do it, but as far as one part of the world is concerned, well, they already have a tradition. Another part has another tradition. I mean, but they all intersect, and it's possible to, as we've done throughout history, to interact together. But there's, to answer you directly, there's no complete knowledge in a literal sense. Let's not be too literal about everything. We talk about completion and perfection, but we have to be careful what our mind invents.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I think, there are some questions. Nurdan Hocam, do you have any questions, Sinem Hocam? Okay, so Kerem Hocam have some question. Sinem Hocam, please. Kerem Hocam, maybe later you can
No,
ask.
I was clapping. I was clapping.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Kerem Hocam, if you want, you can ask the last question.
I mean, I think we're all tired. And
Okay.
these discussions, they never end.
Okay.
But I enjoyed it, and I'll just say one thing very quickly. I think that just by way of defending, right, contemporary philosophy, I would say that with the work of Pierre Hadot, for example, who looked back to the classics and developed, introduced this notion of philosophy as a way of life. I think this might be a segue from where we are now to move towards philosophy as a way of life. And then maybe people will change, and then maybe we'll be able to have a different society.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we can finish the meeting. Yes, thank you, Professor Shaker, for your really comprehensive talk, comments, and kind answer. So next flows of talk will be face-to-face in the campus, Göztepe campus. So audience, thank you for joining us. See you next meeting. Thank you again, Professor Shaker, for joining us in today's talk. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very
Very
much.
good.
It's been a
Very
great pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure indeed. Thank you so much.
Yes.